All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second session in this series. After talking about globalization and free trade for decades, in the last few years, the political discussion anyway seems to have shifted somewhat. In response to the pandemic and the supply chain problems that it exposed, in response to US-China trade tensions, discussion of free trade has been replaced, or at least supplemented, by conversations around nearshoring, friendshoring, ally shoring, and such new terms. In our first seminar, a month or so ago, we heard from CFR's Shannon O'Neill, who argued that regionalism has long been and will remain a central feature of the global economy. Today, we're going to build on that discussion with two excellent speakers whose work has really been at the cutting edge of how we understand global supply chains and global value chains. Our first speaker will be Laura Alfaro, and our second speaker will be Karina Fernandez Stark, who I'll introduce more fully right before her presentation. Laura Alfaro is the Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School, where she's been on faculty since 1999. In addition to her many academic achievements, she served as Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy for Costa Rica from 2010 to 2012. Since earning her doctorate in economics at UCLA, she's been a leader in the study of international capital flows, foreign direct investment, sovereign debt, trade, and emerging markets. And today, she'll be discussing her very recent work, Global Supply Chains, the Looming Great Reallocation. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you and Greg for the invitation. So this is joint work with David Chor from Dartmouth. This is a piece we were asked to present at Jackson Hole on this topic of the global supply chains. And we both joked that we're the small open economy representatives. I'm from Costa Rica and he's from Singapore. And I'm also old enough by now to see my life as one of the poster child of globalization. I was born in one country. I came to study in the US. I married someone from another country, a Brazilian. We have been all over, back and forth. And so I do remember with optimism the 90s, where falling transportation costs and falling policy barriers, plus technological change, was a time when firms would go all over in the attempt to improve efficiency, trying to find where to produce, where to source inputs, where to sell. And in this process, they were bringing growth and development opportunities to many countries. So in Costa Rica, in the 90s, Intel decided to open a plant in my country. And I do see that as an example of this globalization era. They were truly trying to diversify. Costa Rica was never going to be the lowest cost producer. They were trying to diversify away from Asia, and they found Costa Rica to be a great location. And this also is the case why if you ever meet an economist from Costa Rica, the probability that they wrote a paper on multinationals is actually very high. We were all being inspired by the story of Intel. And so move forward to 10s, to 20s, national disasters, the earthquake in Japan, climate change, the pandemics, the invasion of Ukraine, the terrorist attack against Israel, national security events. Again, all of this has led to a rethinking of supply chains and whether they have exposed firms and countries to disruption risks. This in the background, a backlash in particular in developed countries, or the benefits of globalization. This is a work that I have been doing with David, but also Maggie Chen from Washington University, where we have documented that the rise in barriers in the US is because it's very hard for survey participants to disentangle benefits and costs of trade without, from a view that all trade in the US is trade with China and is costing jobs. And so we have had policy makers, Janet Yellen, as was mentioned, saying this, that maybe we should favor friends in supply chains to lower the risks of the economy. And so what we did in this paper is we decided to take a little bit of a broad range look of the evolution of the US supply chains going back to the 90s until now, with a particular focus of the last 5 years, restricted with the available data. And we looked at different forms of patterns, products, modes, value chain position, economic activity for signs of friend-near reshoring. And in this paper, we make 2 big points. Next. I don't know if Greg is managing the slides in the background or they got stuck. Oh, are the slides moving, or
are they?
am I the
they're
only
moving
one?
for me. I'm on slide 3. Should I be on 2?
There's a little thing that in mine they're stuck in the first slide, so I don't know what's going. So do you see them moving?
Yeah, I'm going backward now to the second one. Optimism
I'm actually
of the
seeing
19.
Yeah, so anyways, well, I don't know what you're seeing, so let me advance. So we make 2 points. The first is that, at least from the point of view of the United States, we are not seeing deglobalization yet. And by the way, this is a point that has also been made by a co-author from the Econ Department, Polantras, but also Richard Baldwin. At least in the case of the US, in 2022, we saw the highest level of imports. And again, one needs to be careful, because we wouldn't see the growth rates we saw in the 90s. Those were growth rates that came from a very low base. So it's not, you don't get the same growth rates when you go from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2, as you're going from 101 to 102. So it's unlikely we're gonna see those very big growth rates, and probably they shouldn't be the benchmark. So as we argue, we're not seeing deglobalization yet, but what we are seeing is a reconfiguration of the US global value chains. We have seen a reduction in the share that US imports from China, close to 5 percentage points, and a move to friends, Vietnam, as an example of low cost, Mexico as an example of near. And we raise 2 concerns. The first one is that there is evidence that this is costly, and we proxy this with unit value costs. But the other one is that this may ultimately not reduce dependence from China. And I'll go into more detail. So going at the next slide, looking at the patterns of US trade since the 90s, the 90s saw a shift when the US changed partners from some high-income countries to low-income countries. So Japan was changed by China, Canada by Mexico. What is interesting is that even in these broad changes, the US has maintained very broad regional consistent patterns. And I think you mentioned it. If anything, in the US, value chains are more regional than global. So it has been 30% NAFTA, 20% EU. If rich Germany and France lose market share, Eastern Europe gains market share. And as I said, also close to 40 Asian Pacific. What is also interesting is that rich countries have been engaged in the US, but through foreign direct investment. And in the paper, we mentioned in detail the case of Japan. Japan, 70s, 80s, 90s, dealt with also protectionism, but also increasing labor costs by opening affiliates in the US and also in other countries. So if one looks at the penetration of a Japanese firm adding imports and also direct sales from affiliates, it turns out that the penetration is larger than the one of Chinese firms, and for sure larger than we tend to think and give a credit. That would be the blue line in the slides. The other thing we mentioned is the change in the position of US exports and imports relative to the value chain. Here we use a measure that my co-author has constructed that is called upstreamness. This is a measure of how far you are from the final consumer. So if you sell toys and clothes, you're very you're next to the final consumer, so you're very downstream. If you're chemicals, oil, agricultural products, you're very far from the final consumer, so you're very upstream. Turns out the US exports are relatively upstream in general, but for sure compared to imports. The 2000s saw this interesting change in the US imports as the US became energy independent. So energy independence in the US meant that the upstreamness of imports went down a lot. No need to import as much oil. And so now, during this period, most of the imports were very close to the consumer. Again, this change is associated with the US independence that happened in the 2000s. And there is a little bit of an increase in upstreamness at the end of the sample, and I'll come back to this. Next slide. So then we zoom in the period of 2017 to 22. In this period, as I said, US imports grew 6%. Real imports of non-oil products for 4.2. This is a period also where the US actually sells more to China, imports more from China. But what happened is a reallocation away from China, close to 5%. Asia loses market share. Who wins market share? Vietnam wins market share. And then what we call high income Asia, Taiwan, Korea, middle income Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, India. Interestingly, nearshoring, Canada and Mexico also gained market share. And it is interesting because already the relation of the US with Canada and Mexico was already high. They won even more market share. We also look at 4 sectors that have been part of the policy debates: auto parts, semiconductors, and electronics. And you can do a little bit of eyeballing econometrics, in particular in the semiconductor sector. In the semiconductor sector, you can see the clear decline in the China import share and how it has been won by a lot of the countries in Asia. You see also a little bit in electronics, which has been won by Mexico. In terms of auto, also Mexico winning market share, and some parts, but also Vietnam. And so in the paper, we go into some more, if you want, systematic analysis, just to show that this is not just the anecdotes we're hearing. We look at 4 digits, the trade data. Let me see at 4 digits, things that have lost market share in China to the US, who has won that market share. And we find that it has been statistically significant in Vietnam, Mexico, Canada, but also, as I said, middle income Asia, high income Asia. And this is Ireland and Switzerland because it's the COVID medical products. This relation is negative because China lost market share and these countries won market share. So there's a negative relation. And what is interesting is that pretty much these countries explain the changes. We don't get significance from the rest of the world. And so you can see, you can start playing and looking in detail what is the digit 845, the digit 8716, and you can go into this rat hole all over these sectors and trying to understand. It actually does become very addictive. And so what we did is just to created some analysis of what are the sectors that are winning and losing. Vietnam is gaining, already was gaining some market share on very downstream products because China developed. Development is paying higher wages. And so many things were not making sense to produce in China. They started to move to Vietnam. So apparel, I don't know who on earth in the US imports all these plastic floor coverings, but they're all coming from Taiwan. And then it moved a little bit upstream relative to very low downstream, microphones, electric sets, telephone sets. So a lot of things that are very intensive in labor are starting to move to Vietnam. In the case of Mexico, it's a little bit more all over. So there's no clear relation with labor share. If anything, it's a little bit more intensive in the use of labor. Less intensive, but some are more. But what is clear, it seems to be products that are a little bit heavier, if you want, and that it makes sense just to be close. Auto parts, iron, steel products. But what is amazing is the deep relation that Mexico has with the US. Pretty much everything is imported now from Mexico. And I think this is known. I was just impressed when I saw it in the data. It's a very deep relation that the US has with Mexico. And we also found that in general, tariffs played a role in this reallocation, which leads us to our first caution. It is increasing prices. So if something you don't import now from China, so this is a negative, it is now more expensive. Yes, the next slide. And we found that from Vietnam is close to 10% more expensive. From Mexico is close to 3% more expensive. So again, if a firm is being pushed to move faster than it would have wanted, it is likely to have higher costs. In the next slide, we show using earning calls that this is not just a feature of trade, this is the intent of firms. We go and look that indeed, if we look for firms that were saying, I want to reallocate from China to Vietnam, I want to reallocate China from Mexico, and we find that to be the case in the data. We find more generally the firms were not trying to invest more in China after the tariffs, but this was the case even before. I think it's well known that there were some changes in the business environment and already firms were diminishing some of their plans in China. In the next slide, our caution number 2. We looked also from this greenfield data, information of where China is investing, and we find that even during COVID, they were investing in Vietnam and Mexico. So Vietnam, the data is not great, but it's known that the share of Chinese firms is high, 7-10%. Mexico has extremely detailed data. One can go by product, country of origin, and province. And overwhelmingly is still US foreign direct investment dominating Mexico. But when you go into auto and auto parts, 75% is coming from China. So again, Chinese firms are following the same strategy that Japanese firm of trying to move abroad. They cannot come to the US, they're going to Mexico, they're going to Vietnam. We also see it in trade. In trade, we see that the top 5 trading partners of the US, in every single one of them except Japan, the share of China's imports went up. Or if it's not going up, it's either 1 or number 2. It turns out this is true in G20 countries. In every G20 country, the Chinese imports are either number 1 or number 2, and in most increasing. So again, the likelihood of someone buying a product from China is going down when it's a direct import, but it's not necessarily going down if it's indirect through imports or a Chinese firm setting up in a country where the US imports from. We finish the paper by looking for evidence on reshoring. In the next slide, we show you what I mentioned, that there is an increase in the upstreamness of US imports. That means that these things that used to be imported most likely are now being produced inside. In the next slide, we show some evidence on establishments employment. Again, this one needs to be careful. A lot of these plans have been announced. It will take time to materialize. We're just looking at employment and number of firms. You do see that in some sectors, activity has rebounded, but at least in auto and auto parts, it is hard to argue that it was the Trump tariffs. The trend precedes the Trump tariffs and were perhaps due to policies that happened before. Semiconductors is the one that you do see an increase in labor share. Electronics is not there yet, and as I mentioned, a lot is going to Mexico. Having said that, let's keep in mind that manufacturing is 10% of US employment, and these sectors are 20% of that 10%. So again, the share of employment in these sectors for the size of the UN economy is not that high. So to conclude, and I don't know if this can be seen, we do document this, what we call great reallocation from China to France and to countries that are nearby. We do caution this is likely to be costly, and it's unlikely that the relation with China will end indirectly. Then again, this is not the objective of the government. The government officials have been, especially more recently, clear that it's not that they want to end the relation. They just want to end it in certain products. Having said that, given the increase in costs, we do argue that it's important, as these policies take effect, to reevaluate the cost of the policy. Again, there is some potential justification for subsidies if we do think that they're dynamic gains. We do know we have a methodology to measure them. The measurement is not always precise, but we do have a methodology. And we argue that it's important to do a cost benefit in terms of the policies and political and possible implications. Again, if anything, one may argue that independently of what the politicians are saying, these policies are likely to stay because, again, it is just going to many states across different political lines. But it is important to evaluate in particular because it might be changing the way we interact in the international economy. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura, for that really granular and excellent look at the way that the relationships of the United States economy are shifting to an extent, and in particular the depth of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and how, in some sectors at least, that seems to be growing even deeper. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions about that, but for the moment, we're going to turn to our second presenter. Karina Fernandez Stark is a senior fellow at the Duke Center for International Development and a co-founder of the international consulting firm Trade Upgrader, which focuses on the positions of developing economies in the global value chain. She's been a leading international consultant for some years, including with the Inter-American Development Bank, the OECD, UNCTAD, and the World Bank, amongst others. Together with Gary Gireffi, Karina authored the highly cited book, The Global Value Chain Analysis, a primer. And personally, I was very pleased to work with Karina and her co-author, Penny Bamber, for a recent book that I edited with Alan Burson, North America 2.0, Forging a Continental Future. And she'll be building, in a sense, on her chapter in that book on North America in global value chains. Karina, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So I also prepare a PowerPoint presentation, and I would like to ask if somebody can share the presentation.
I will. I'm right in the process of getting it loaded here. I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's just not
We're having some
up.
technology shocks.
Oh my goodness, yes. I don't know what I could do to get it. I'm still waiting on it. For some reason, it's not moving over to the frame. Oh, here we go.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate the patience.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, one more time. It's a great pleasure to present this topic today. And also thank you to Laura for a great presentation. So this morning, as Tom said, I'm going to present the chapter that we prepared with Penny Bamber in the book that Tom and Alan Bursin co-edited. So the chapter is how North America can turn today's turbulent economic environment into a competitive advantage. So I'm a global value chain specialist, and I have been doing research using this analytical tool for almost 20 years. And during that time, the GVC analysis has been mainly used to understand economic dynamics. But recently, with the pandemic, the Ukraine-Russia war, the economic tensions between the US and China, the GVC methodology has been proven to be valuable in offering insights into the geopolitical landscape. So we all know that global value chains dominate today's international trade. As Laura mentioned, the fragmentation of industries has allowed numerous countries to participate in this international trade without having to develop the full range of capabilities across the chain. As Laura is very interesting because we work a lot with Costa Rica, probably in the year 2013, analyzing the medical devices and semiconductors and offshore services. So we can see countries like Costa Rica or other countries like, I don't know, Nicaragua, Moldova, and the Philippines can participate, in this case, in the automobile industry, but providing low value manufacturing. So just a segment of the value chain. A point that is really important is that these chains have a governance structure. And this governance structure means how power is distributed among the different actors in the chain. And here, a very powerful actor are the lead firms. And these lead firms decide which locations, countries around the world participate in these globalized industries, the same that Laura mentioned, these outsourcing, where to go, and the investment decisions. But today we see that there is a geography shifting, and the understanding of the global value chain competitiveness is being redefined for one based only on profits to one founded on resiliency, quality, and also is getting every day more important, the sustainability, the environmental sustainability. Next slide, please. So, no, one previous, please. Yeah. North America is an influential force in most global value chains through its firm's leadership. They participate in the highest segments of the value chain. US is the leader in many chains and dominate global production system, influencing what, how, and where products are going to be produced. Sourcing and investment decisions by US firms have shaped these global value chains over past probably 3 decades. And the United States participate in the highest segments of the chains, primarily R&D, design, branding. And these US firms dominate global rankings from R&D and innovation, accounting for 35% of the world's 1,000 leading R&D spenders. And all that investments contribute directly to technological capabilities and help US firms lead these global value chains. So Canada fulfills 2 GVC roles. One, natural resources provider, so upstream in the chain, but also downstream as a niche high-value manufacturers. Then Mexico, we see Mexico started participating in global value chains early, probably 30 years ago. And the original role was a low-value assembly provider. And we see all the large-scale maquilas around the border with the United States. But Mexico has been upgrading and has been moving up in the value chain, and nowadays is not the low value assembly providers and has been moving to more a medium and high producer, high value added producers. So with these changing global dynamics, it's important to analyze the region, the North America region, in the global context. So next slide, please. So how does North American group shape up compared to other significant regional groups globally? These graphs show the relevant development levels of the member of three major regional groups. Okay, first is RCEP from Asia, then in the middle, USMCA, and EU27. Each dot in the graph represents a country, and they are distributed according to their GDP per capita. And these three groups account for 3/4 of the world's GDP, 30%, 28%, and 18% respectively. So let's start analyzing the first group, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. It's a new group that entered into force in 2022, last year. It is a free trade agreement between the Asian countries, and 5 free trade partners are Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and Republic of Korea. These 15 countries bring together around 30% of the global population and 30% of the world's GDP. These countries represent a diverse range of GDP per capita and a labor force to perform both low value activities in the value chain, but also high value activities in the chain. Inter-regional trade in Asia has already been high and growing rapidly. It's around 58%. And with this trade pact is expected to increase 2% per year. In terms of productivity gains, it is estimated that real income is going to increase by 2.5%, and trade is going to expand among the RCEP members by 12% in 2035. So RCEP has the potential to lift 27 million additional people to middle class status by 2035. Now moving to the EU27, no, go back. We go to the last part of the graph. The intra-regional trade in the European Union is even higher, 68%. And since the beginning, the European Union has steadily expanding the membership from 15 countries to 27. The invitation of Hungary, Poland, Central and Eastern Europe countries to the EU has contributed to a greater differentiator in cost and capabilities across the bloc. And then at the center, we observe USMCA with just 3 member countries. The intra-regional trade is the lowest of these 3 major blocs. With this limited scope and scale, North America has grown dependent on other regions, particularly Asia, to fulfill key low and medium manufacturing activities within the supply chains. So North America has instead decoupled from the region, from the Americas region, from their closest neighbors in Latin America, and turned decidedly into Asia. So if we see the next slide, North America is growing their dependence on Asia. Lead firms have offshore low and medium value production to Asia. As an example, the US companies led foreign direct investment into China By 2020, US investors accounted for the largest share of Chinese FDI stock. And in terms of trade, between the year 2000 and 2001, the US share of imports from Asia almost tripled, from 485 billion to 1.24 trillion. And this has been led by imports from China, Japan, and South Korea. But simultaneously, imports from its southern neighbors have declined. Let's see the next slide. And this has completely shifted the trade dynamics for Latin America. As shown in the diagram, within just 2 decades, China has replaced the US as South America's largest export destination. And South America, which traditionally was a trade partner to the US, as seen in the map in the year 2000, has to look for opportunities in other regions and has been looking to Asia. And these positive trade flows with Asia has fostered trade agreements. Nowadays, the largest number of interregional trade agreements globally are between Asia and South America. And we see that today natural resources flow primarily from the southern cone to Asia when they manufacture in Asia, and then the products are sold to North America. And in fact, it's interesting to see the news that they show that Africa and China relationship and is getting a lot of attention in the press. But actually, LATAM is now Asia's largest extra-regional supplier of raw materials. So North America's failure to engage in a more comprehensive regional economic initiative has strengthened this trade relationship between South America and Asia. So paradoxically, the more North America depends on Asia, the deeper the relationship is between Asia and South America. And the more competitive and powerful Asia has grown. And this has left North America with a diminishing influence in the region that can be a concern for the point of view of the long-term security. Next slide, please. So there are opportunities. We come back to the same graphic that I presented before, but we have been adding Latin American countries and showing the Americas. And this approach could contribute to the region's diverse capability. And we know that is not possible to fully replace Asian manufacturing machine. North America must foster the development of this middle in manufacturing. It should be encouraged the diversification, probably replication of production operations in the Americas. And this is going to incentivize regional value chains development, promote interregional trade, and also stabilize relations. While the European Union and Asia have already exploited the trade and labor dividends of working together, in the Americas, these remain largely untapped. This potential partnership, USMCA plus Latin America, would constitute 21 countries. As can you see in the red dots, is a diverse array of GDP per capita, with more low-income countries than Europe and more middle-income countries than Asia. So what Latin America can offer in this partnership? In addition to the regional global prominence as a major source of upstream raw materials, including the critical raw materials such as copper and lithium, Latin America has three largely untapped sources of competitive advantage. First, a large and growing low-cost labor force, diversity in the development level, so they can participate in different segments of the value chain, and abundant green energy. And also, we need to say security, because generating the economic opportunities through stronger commercial ties with Central and South America, this is going to enhance the security and stability of the Western Hemisphere. A continental trade pact would double North America's current labor force to 500 million, and most of South American population is of working age, and its labor force continue to expand in several countries in Central and South America. Next slide. And as I mentioned previously, that North America must foster the development of this missing GVC middle and focusing this manufacturing within the Americas by encouraging this diversification and maybe replication of production operations. But it requires a major policy efforts, and it's going to be mainly in four areas. First is negotiate accumulation allowances across multilateral trade agreements with Central and South America. We believe that a second step should be done, that is linking or create a bigger pact between USMCA with CAFTA and the Pacific Alliance. Later include the Mercosur. Second is invest in upgrading hard and soft trade infrastructure to connect the Americas. We know that this is one of the weakest points of countries in Latin America, and they are fundamental if the Americas wants to create regional value chains. The third factor is lead workforce development to create capabilities for regional value chains. As we know, North America leads several industries and they have great knowledge. So how they can move and transfer that knowledge to Latin America will be really important. And finally, prioritize the development of sustainable production chains in the region. And we see that the Latin America has made great effort in moving to green energy, especially countries like Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Nicaragua. So the cost of successful regionalization, we know that is high financially, and it will take considerable economic vision and also is going to require political will. However, the inaction could mean risking North America's leadership of the global economy and squandering its competitive edge. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Karina. And I'd invite everyone to, you could either, I think, raise your hand and ask your question directly, or you can ask your question via the chat. We have a couple questions from Greg, but I wanted to see if there's anyone who has a burning question that they would like to add. Maybe while we're waiting for people to formulate those. From Greg, we have one question for each presenter. For Laura Alfaro, what 2 or 3 factors will affect the speed and magnitude of this great relocation or reallocation? And will environmental and social governance considerations influence the extent to which that happens? And for Karina Fernandez Stark, what you mentioned actually kind of towards the end, infrastructure investments as being a really important area that the Americas would need to focus on, both North America and to connect with the broader Americas. But Greg asked sort of what sorts of infrastructure investments might be important, and how might we distinguish in a sense between the gains of trade in regional rather than global cooperation? Are there arguments to be made in a sense for regional rather than global cooperation? And in the meantime, please do add any questions in the chat or raise your hand. Laura, would you like to start off?
Yes, thank you very much. So as I mentioned, the first consideration for a lot of the firms has been how permanent within the boundaries of an investment plan are the tariffs and the subsidies. I think the tariffs, there's been a change in government and they have stayed. And I think the subsidies, I also think, independently of what has been said, and independently of the 80-year-old person who rules the US, I think they're also going to stay. And that confidence of some view that these policies are going to stay 4 or 5 years, maybe another political cycle, means that a lot of firms have just started the plans. Many were before thinking maybe I should move or diversify away from China just because it became more expensive, then there is the conflict. I think now that they also have some incentives to do it, and they're doing it. And so how fast it happens is now going to depend on cost, but the other one is availability of specialized resources. So many firms that wanted to open plants in the US have not found high-skilled labor. And high-skilled labor is not only a scientist, but sometimes is the specialized person who knows how to construct a semiconductor plant. In the US, they found out no one knows how to do it, so they have to go to Taiwan and bring. And I think that's going to be the biggest delay. Those specialized resources that happen across the supply chain and across the process from building the plant to then starting the plant, that are going to be the main limitations. On terms of ESG considerations, so we use trade data that doesn't allow us to go deep into this. So even the same 4-digit code product or even 6-digit may be produced clean or may not be produced clean. I think one example that is being used and mentioned a lot now that the Europeans are going to do their carbon tax is steel. Brazilian steel is extremely clean. I think people are just not aware that Brazilian electric grid is very clean. It's a lot of hydro, it's a lot of solar and wind, and also a lot of wind. So steel in Brazil is actually very clean. And it's hard to see that if you just don't know the name of the company, and the trade data just doesn't tell me the name of the company. So let me not venture into that answer, but I think it's going to play some role, again, because of some of the restrictions and incentives that are being placed.
Great, thank you, Laura. Karina, on infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. Regarding infrastructure for regional pact is going to be really important, not only the hard infrastructure in which you require ports and roads and airports, but also this soft infrastructure in trade facilitation. We have seen major issues in that regard with a lot of bureaucracy. Has been doing better after the pandemic, has improved, but it requires a lot of work and also digitalize many systems. Regarding the question about the workforce, I believe they refer about the concerns in the domestic economies, like in the US, why I'm going to send works abroad. But right now, what is the debate here is how to minimize the role of Asia. So in order to minimize the role of Asia, it's going to be impossible that just Canada, US, and Mexico can replace this manufacturing superpower of Asia. So it requires more labor force. And this is something that Latin America can offer. Actually, with Penny, we were doing research last year on medical devices, and it was really interesting that in the United States, they didn't have enough personnel to run certain medical devices facilities, that they have to send people from Costa Rica, fly people from Costa Rica to the operations in the United States. So there are shortages of workers in United States, and for sure, if they want resiliency, they need to duplicate factories, and it's going to need these, as I mentioned, low, medium, and high capabilities across the Americas.
Great. I have a question that I'll add in if we don't have anyone, but if anyone would like to raise your hand, please do go ahead. So I just got back from the Doha Forum, and most of the discussion was around Gaza. But when people were talking about the economy, they were talking about things like nearshoring and friendshoring, and how this fits into U.S.-China competition. And one speaker was the foreign minister from Bangladesh, and an economist himself said, we've been talking to our students and talking about free trade for decades. This is a mistake. His perspective was much more focused on the losers and the potential losers from this, and so that's a little bit where I wanted to direct the question. Who is likely to lose out? Laura, you mentioned higher cost to consumers, but what are the losses from this emphasis on nearshoring or friendshoring?
So I once heard an economist that I think is very good, Kim Rule. You don't know him, you should. He's very good. Say, I am unapologetically in favor of free trade. And I decided to steal his line. I am unapologetically in favor of free trade. And not only because I'm from a small open economy, and believe me, I can live on bananas and coffee. I just don't think we should. I don't think we're gonna reach higher development levels of development. But I don't think this is also only the case for Costa Rica. It has also been the case for the US. Right now, the unemployment rate in the US is the lowest it has been since the 60s. It's 3.7. But by the way, it has been like that on average. The US there was the global financial crisis and the pandemic, but on average, the US has maintained very low unemployment rates, despite or because, I would argue, the increase in trade. The losses that have been experienced, and trade has reallocation effects the same way that technology has reallocation effects, can be managed. Training, education. The thing that made it a little bit tricky was the speed. It is true that the China shock happened too fast, and perhaps this is something that we need to keep in mind. And in fact, this is why I'm a little bit worried about AI. I am not worried about the technology. I am worried about the speed. People need time to transition, to find some other jobs, to learn and retrain. And again, I think also what's going on is that there is a view that is very much related with geopolitics dominating the world. That I do have to say that we economists are not very good at creating frameworks from national security, and so perhaps we shouldn't completely discount it. But in terms of trade, I think if there were some interest, we can find ways to make it better for many people. The US, before COVID, was failing education. After COVID, like study after study, test after test, is showing the dismal situation of math in the US. I never hear about what the US is doing to solve this. I am shocked that there is not like a global uproar as opposed to kids complaining about something they don't know about, and it's not about them, about the state of math in the US. I think if we all came together and tried to solve that, that would make a huge benefit in terms of the reallocation of the gains. And again, it's not only for trade, it's going to be about AI as well. AI is an equal destroyer of jobs. The people who thought that they were saved by languages, by coding, by art, by music, no, everyone is going. But again, that doesn't seem to be the priority in the US. And then that's when we get populists and populism. And that is a little bit sad.
Karina, you have the last word.
Okay, no, just to reinforce the point, Latin America has been the loser, hasn't been growing in the past 2 decades. So Latin America wasn't prepared to be in these global value chains and participate because the same reasons, the education, because infrastructure, etc., but also because of geopolitics. As Laura is saying, they play an essential role. So I think Latin America needs a powerful player that can, or not savior, but that they can work together and not be the loser, as has been, and not be only providing raw materials and that's it. But also moving to higher value activities and giving. And in order to do that, needs that support, needs infrastructure, needs workforce development, etc. And North America can provide that. And I think if this happens, America is going to be really strong in order to play in these global value chains that we have also European Union and we have Asia. So that is the main message.
Well, thank you both for excellent presentations and a great discussion. With that, we'll go ahead and close. We're at the hour, and we'll be rejoining in January, where we'll be talking a little bit about North America in a global context, as well as perhaps some discussion of the North American Leaders Summit. Greg, is there anything you'd like to add before we go?
No, that talk is going to be on the 16th, and we will keep working on making Teams less glitchy. So thank you. And
great. Thank
Laura
you so much,
and Karina,
everyone.
thank you very much. Wonderful presentations.
Thank you very much, and enjoy holidays.
Thank you.
Have a great
Happy holidays, everyone.
Ciao. Bye.
Goodbye.
Ciao.